Right, so today we're going to carry on with our look at stuff. For some reason, when I have the VGA connection, everything seems to shift to the right, but well, hopefully that'll be fine. We're going to have a look at attributes and keys. Ask any questions. We'll have a look as we go along on QChan. Those of you who spammed it last week, it's not the end of the world, but bear in mind it's hard for other people to read. If you want to spam, there is that experimental channel where you can break it. And thank you to those of you that have had a look, and especially one person whose name I've forgotten, who will go in the credits for QChan, who sent through a whole load of useful suggestions. So today we're going to carry on looking at the logical side of database design. We're going to have a look at attributes and keys, how we identify stuff. So we're basically going to move from the conceptual essence of databases, i.e., what is an entity, what are they, what do we represent, to the logical designs. So we're going to now start looking at fleshing out our entities in terms of what they contain and looking at keys. So as you'll remember from earlier this week, last week, an entity is a distinct thing with independent existence about which we store data. So in most systems, the nouns are the entities: student, car, vehicle, plane. An instance of an entity, one student in particular, one lecturer in particular, is just that, it's an instance, but the entity is the controlling thing. To put it in sort of Java terms, I know you just had sort of Richard doing what fiendish challenges in terms of Java, we'd be looking at an entity being a class, and then we can talk about an object being an instance of that class as we go through. Once we've mapped out our entities, we know what they are, we also look to understand what the relationships are between them. And with the relationship, we talk about the cardinality, this idea that we use fancy words. Cardinality means the numerical relationship between the entities. And these are, one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many, and then furthermore, can it be zero? So, I may have 0 or more bottles of Diet Coke, but it is possible for me to have 0. I'd find that quite offensive and I'd be upset, but it is possible for that to happen. Likewise, I own this Coke and no one dare take it off me. So that's the kind of way we go. And do we have to have one? And in fact, we can go further. We can have complicated relationships where we say, you have to have 2 or 3, but no more, and this kind of thing. So we can put numbers on them. And we represent this in the ERD using one of a number of different diagram formats, and we'll come back to look at these. And in fact, later on in the semester, we'll specifically look at comparing different types of diagrammatic format. But feeding back from the practical you had earlier in the week, I know a lot of you, I was going around, I tried to see as many of you as I could. Quite a lot of people were using a different formatting because they'd learned that at A-level or whatever. I like this one, and this is the one we'll generally use in this coursework because it's simple. If there's a 0 there or a spot, it means it can be 0. If there's not, it has to be 1 or more. And when it's a many relationship, there's a fork. So it seems fairly straightforward. So that's entities, and that's what we started with last week in terms of looking at the kind of conceptual essence. And now we're going to move on and we're going to have a look at attributes. So attributes basically are the properties or the characteristics of an entity. Now we will eventually turn these into fields within our table, columns within our database. These are going to be items that we're going to store data about. And nearly every entity will have a bunch of attributes about it, and we'll come on to have a look at some of these in a minute. And we can also put on classifications of this attribute. So we can have, is it a required or an optional attribute? Does everything that we store data about have to have information of this attribute? Is it simple or composite, single or multi-valued, stored or derived? And is it an identifier attribute, what we call a key? So required or optional is a simple question. Is it absolutely required for an instance of the entity, or can it be blank? It's not just as simple as, do all entities have this attribute? If we think about, say, people, everyone will have a height. But if I'm storing a database of students, I might want to have a field of a height. I might want to have an attribute I can take of a height. But just because everyone has a height doesn't mean that I necessarily am storing everybody's height. And if I make it required, what I'm saying is you cannot store information about this student unless you meet the required fields. So generally, the required fields, we try and keep those as few as possible. We don't want to have a huge amount of required data, or else if we don't know one of those things, we cannot create an instance of that entity to represent that entity in the real world. So that's what we do. So required versus optional. There's some stuff, it's not unreasonable to expect that when you enroll, we might need, required field, your UCAS number, your date of birth, and your name. But we probably wouldn't necessarily need to know all of the other things that we might store about you. And usually what we do is we would tend to, when we're mapping out our attributes, we would have some of them that are required and some of them that aren't. In a computer system, we need name and email or password. These are required fields, required attributes. But other stuff like an office, a phone number, these are attributes that you probably have, but we don't necessarily need them in order to create the data in the database. Is the attribute simple or composite? So simple attributes are, as it says on the tin, fairly simple. They are self-contained. They are things which are made up from one item, name, whatever. Composite attributes, on the other hand, tend to be actually made up from multiple other attributes. The most common example you would give is things like an address or a title or something like that. So the name here, is a string of self-contained text. It's very simple, but an address is probably not just a string of self-contained text, which we could use, but is almost certainly actually going to be first line, second line, third line, town, county, postcode, country, that kind of thing. So actually, the composite address attribute is made up from lots of individual attributes that go into it in the first place. The reason why we want to do this, it makes our lives easier when we split things out, because then we're able to reference them separately. If I just ask you for an address as a textual field, I have very little control over the formatting that goes into it. If, however, I require you to give me a street name, a town name, a postcode, it becomes a lot easier for me later on to reference that data. For example, I want to target people that live in the BT9 postcode or whatever in order to pull it out. Is the attribute single or multi-valued? So remember, at this point, we're not talking about databases. We're not talking about actually building tables. What we're talking about is the conceptual essence, of the data that we're gathering. Is that attribute only ever going to have one value? Height, shoe size, IQ. Or could it potentially have multiple values? Skill sets, degrees, interests, favorite colors, plural. At this point, all we're interested in doing is identifying this. Now, in database speak, we might be talking here about a sort of one-to-many relationship, but we're a way away from actually defining that. At the minute, we're just talking about the entity. Is there an attribute of the entity that has multiple values stored at any one time? Could have multiple values. So these are single versus multi-valued attributes. Is the attribute stored or derived? Stored attribute is the data we actually put in the database. Name, surname, date of birth, etc. Derived attributes are attributes that the entity has, but we derive them from other data. So we don't actually store it as a number, we store it as a calculation, or we store it as a sum within the database. The most obvious one is age. If I stored in the database age as an attribute, at least every 12 months, it would be wrong. You would get older, and the database would still have it in. So instead, what we commonly do is we say, OK, we have your age, and we have date of birth. Date of birth is a stored attribute. Age is a derived attribute. If we know your date of birth, and we know the date today, we can derive the age from it. Likewise, we might have the formal name. We might have a postal system. We have a list of people we're going to write letters to apologize for something terrible that we did at Queen's. And we want to write to them and say, the joke wasn't funny, and I'm really sorry for the offence caused to your children that were in the class, and all that kind of stuff. And so I might have, title, first name, last name. We store these. So I might have a formal address as title, initial, surname. I don't store this. I want to derive it, because otherwise it would be duplication of data. So stored fields we store, derived fields we derive. So I'm pushing through this so we can get out in terms of the snow. So let's have a quick go then. Let's play attributes, and I'll have a look and see if there's any questions asked while we're doing it. So just very quickly, we'll only do the first one. So have a think about what are the attributes and the classifications of a monkey. All right, a cheeky monkey. Level of cheekiness is important. All right, so just 2 minutes. Do that really quickly, and then we'll come back and we'll have a quick look. Okay, that'll do. A couple of minutes. I see you all talking. I see people are spamming away at the Q-chan, even though I asked you from my heart of hearts not to. I will find all of the Owens, and I will deal with you robustly. Stop it. This is logged. I will take it. And apparently someone swore, but I haven't yet found it. I'll find it, though. Okay, so let's have a look. So monkey, right? What have we got? We've got a few sensible answers. Colour of monkey, yes. Subtype of monkey. There are many different types of monkey. I'm a big fan of monkeys. There are lots of different types. I like the ones with blue bottoms that throw things at tourists. That's always good. Okay. Name of monkey, yes. Species, age, absolutely. So for a monkey, there's a whole bunch of different things, and we would probably store most of these as simple attributes. Species, type, colour, these kind of things. Age would be a derived value, I would expect. Are there any multiple things that we would store? Potentially multi-value things that we would store about the monkeys? Foods? Foods that the monkey likes? Allergies? These kind of things. These would be attributes of the monkey, but they may well have multiple values. When we come to the database, we'll have to do it. And as I say, we'll crack on through this so we can get out of the get home before snow shuts everything down. So when we come on to drawing pictures, because remember, this is databases, we always end up drawing a picture somehow, this is what an entity relationship diagram of attributes looks like. So we have, as with a normal EID, we have our entity in a square box in the middle, and then we have a variety of oval things as we go along. So a standard attribute has a solid line, multi-valued attribute, a double line, derived attribute, a dotted line, and then finally a composite attribute is shown with a solid line, but we have our parts come off it, which show what actually makes up the overall thing. So if we had an employee, this is the kind of thing that we'd probably have. We'd have an employee entity in the middle, and going round, we've got a set of skills. This is going to be multi-valued, an employee ID, date they were employed, date of birth, an address made up from composite values, and then we'd have a couple of derived attributes. So things like length of service, so how much holiday are they entitled to, how many spine points they're going up on the pay, derived based on the date employed, and also their age based on the date of birth, so we can work them out. So it's fairly straightforward, fairly simple. You just need to remember which box goes where, which have dotted lines and which have solid lines. Let's not do this. Let's skip on through. We're going to draw pictures of monkeys, but that's okay. Snow has stopped play. You can do it at home if you want to draw attribute diagrams of monkeys. So that's attributes. So the idea is that we have an entity, we have a thing, and we have data about that thing. We have attributes associated with it. Hopefully fairly straightforward enough. Everyone okay with that? Yeah? Okay, good. All right. So the next thing we're going to look at today and skip through, we are making very good time, so we should finish nice and early, is identifiers or keys. And these are things that we use to identify instances of entities. So the first thing is that with any data system, we really want to have primary key. So primary key is an attribute or perhaps a combination of attributes that uniquely identifies the individual instances of an entity. So primary key, one or more than one attribute that in combination uniquely identifies an instance of an entity. That combination or that attribute, that value, only refers to one instance of the entity and only one. They're incredibly useful. They're very, very unique, so they're used to do it, and they're usually indexed. They're a very quick way to find an instance of an entity. So what is your primary key as a student? Yes, absolutely. You're not names to us, you're just a number when you join. Yeah? You're given a student number, I have a staff number, that's all it ever is. When I see the Vice Chancellor, he refers to me by number and then sort of slaps me around a bit. I met him the other day. I managed not to disgrace myself. I made one joke and then was shuffled away before I could think I was funny. So, your primary key is a student. Yeah, sure, it's a student number, right? We give everyone a student number when they join. That stays with you. If you come back to Queen's, if you stay on and go and do a master's in a different department, that student number will come back and haunt you. It uniquely identifies you as a student. What uniquely identifies you as a citizen? Sorry? Your tax codes, yeah? National insurance number. Okay. When did you get your national insurance number? 16, is it? When you're allowed to work under 16, but they don't pay you for it very well. So yeah, so anyone who's working as a citizen, I appreciate different countries have different ways of working, has a national insurance number. How do you identify someone before they're 16? So as a child? Sorry? Is that a primary key? Does it have a unique identifier? Healthcare number. Okay, yeah, so every child that's born has a healthcare number. Okay, that works very well in Northern Ireland. Does every child have to have a healthcare number? What about if your parents were, freewheeling anti-vaxxers, we don't take our child to the doctor because they'll poison its mind, man. The child's not registered, right? So it gets more complicated because people are really complicated. So actually, well, me and you, yeah, all right, okay, come on. I thought we were going to agree not to talk about that. That was a hell of a weekend. All right. Yeah, so yeah, you will have, as adults, you have all these unique IDs. So I have a passport number, I've got a national insurance number, I've got a unique taxpayer's reference, I've got a driving license number. Whew, the state identifies me and tracks me everywhere I go. As a child, though, if we wanted to say, oh, this baby, that hasn't yet been to the registry office even, right? We would have to have a composite key. So I'd probably say, okay, so we got a child, got a baby. I didn't bring one in as a prop after last time. But we got a child, it was born. So let's start putting some facts in. Let's say, okay, so we know when it was born, right? We know date of birth. We know its name. We know its parents' names. How likely is it that the parents had twins and called them both the same thing? It's quite unlikely, but you never know, do you? All right? So perhaps if we had the date of birth and the time of birth and the name and the parents' names, we could be and the hospital, we could be fairly confident, right, that would be the way of doing it. But often, that's what we have to do. It's great when people have a number. You might not like it from civil liberties point of view, but it's great when you are 1049, you have it tattooed on your head, you have a prison number. You're used to track it around. You have a student number because it's used to track it. Data, by its essence, in the real world gets messy. So it's worth considering often that we have to have a composite key in order to put stuff together. So in our diagram here, what would be the primary key? What would we use? What do you think we'd use to uniquely identify the employee? Employee ID, yeah? Unless we're really stupid and we give the same employee ID to multiple people. But yeah, employee ID. So the way we notate that in the diagram is we underline it. We often make it bold, but we certainly underline it in order to show that it's gone. So the primary key is underlined. So this shows us in the diagram, okay, this attribute is the primary key. If it's a composite attribute, we underline them all in order to do it. So a simple key then is a single attribute that uniquely identifies individual instances of an entity. So employee ID, national insurance number, driver number, passport number, student number. In our system, we have one unique identifier. That unique identifier references one instance of an entity, and that instance of an entity has one unique identifier that references back. Marvelous. So when it's simple, it's easy. What we do when we start looking at data is we often don't have a clear-cut identification. The first thing we would do is once we gather all the data of the system we're hoping to make is we would identify what are called candidate keys. We'd go through and we'd say, okay, what are the possible unique identifiers or possible keys that could be used on their own or in combination in order to do it? So we identify the candidate keys before deciding on the attributes to use. If we can't find one simple key, as I mentioned, we use a composite key. So a composite key is a combination of attributes that uniquely identifies individual instances of an entity. It's bad practice, usually, to use composite keys. Not always, and we'll come on to this later on with link tables and things like that, where we're not to get too complicated. But generally, the larger entities in the system all should have a unique identifier. We shouldn't have to look at combinations of different things to identify them, but it is possible. And when we do that, when we want to use a composite key to identify things, say we have a student and we don't have a student number, but we have all these different fields, what we might want to do is make a composite key and say, well, name, date of birth, and the address almost certainly going to be unique identifier. Name and date of birth, not necessarily. We might well have two people called the same thing, born on the same day, but it's unlikely we're going to have two people born on the same day living in the same house. You'd hope. But these are the kind of assumptions that you make a composite key, and then you do have two people who are born on the same day and they have the same name, and they're like, oh my God, my name's Dave Clayton too, let's get a house together, and boom, the system breaks. But it's enough that you're aware of this, the idea that if there's one key, it's a simple key, it's a primary key, great. If not, we'll use a combination of attributes in order to sketch things together. And we underline them, because we underline everything. Okay. Let's see. Dr. David, what is your PhD in? I don't know. If you work it out, let me know. My God, people have been spamming in caps, haven't they? So much money. It's just bants more than anything else. Who has any questions in here? Is there any questions about this? Is this all fairly straightforward? Okay, so we would have done more examples. What we'll do is we will call it a day there so everyone can get home nice and early. I'll see you on Thursday if we're not all snowed in. Have a lovely couple of days. Cheerio.